Welcome back to the 1662 Fellowship of North America, where we promote the historic Anglican formularies as the theological center of gravity for Orthodox Anglicanism in North America. I'm Isaac Rayberg, the Archdeacon for Liturgy in the Anglican Diocese of All Nations and the Rector of All Saints Anglican Church in San Antonio, Texas. And today we have the final part of my interview with Bishop Peter Robinson, the Most Reverend Peter Robinson, presiding bishop of the United Episcopal Church of North America. And we're going to begin today's discussion with talking about some theological education, and then we're going to get right back into church history and ceremonial and all that good stuff as well. So stay tuned. And again, we do apologize for the video quality in this series. It was some technical problems, but it'll be better for next time. Thank you so much. Well, I've been keeping you for a while, so let me ask you one more thing, and then we can see where they go. Now, in your diocese, you run the Latimer Theological Institute.
Yes.
Kind of an in-house training. I've paid close attention to a lot of that over the years. How do y'all use these kind of core ideas of that center of gravity, the theological center in your clergy training and that more formal theological education?
Basically, once you get away from dealing with scripture, which is a major part of the program, we tend to look very closely at the prayer book, the 39 articles, and what I would loosely call the Anglican way of doing things, the polity issues. And the tendency always is to try and come back to the unities that underlie the various strands of Anglicanism. So, for example, when you look at the prayer book, we look at the prayer book flat on, but we don't get doctrinaire about ceremonial.
So the script, not so much the stage direction.
Yeah, I mean, I will say to them quite honestly, I will go through the service, and words like shall and may have to be listened to.
Yeah.
When you get to the words of institution, you shall take the bread into your hands, you shall break it, you shall put your hand upon it, you may elevate it. And then you get about a 5-minute discursus from me on why I think elevating in that position is totally wrong with the American prayer book, but that's
part of the Americans. Yeah. Do we have an epiclesis? Do we not have an epiclesis?
Right. I tend to play safe and say that we have a weak epiclesis, therefore do the elevation at the end. But, that is opinion, not law.
Yeah, my training and the one that trained me in the 28 was definitely more from the Anglo-Catholic school. I think we just have multiple elevations to cover the bases.
The other thing I come back to with the 39 articles is just a straightforward grammatical reading.
Yeah.
Because there are places where the 39 articles can in places be more of a, to use a soccer analogy, an offside rule. This is what we do not permit.
Right.
Rather than this is what we believe. The classic example of that is the article on Holy Communion, where the deep six Zwinglian memorialism and transubstantiation.
Right.
You have to work a little harder to discover that they're not that keen on Luther's version of sacramental union.
But it's very, very soft language, yeah, promoting the other
Com
side on that. Yeah.
yeah, compared to how they deal with Zwinglian transubstantiation. I mean, it doesn't get much stronger than overthroweth the nature of a sacrament.
Right.
Whereas they dance around it a bit more with the Lutheran point of view. And then in positive terms, it basically states Bucer and Calvin's view on the Eucharist.
In terms of, yeah, the received spiritually, and
Mm-hmm.
then, the wicked who do not partake the
Yeah.
sacrament. Yeah.
Similarly with predestination. The statement on predestination is single and expressed in very positive terms.
Yeah.
It's really coming out of the Bullinger tradition, or um, even though Lutheranism tends to, put the rubber gloves on every time predestination is mentioned.
Hmm.
If you look at what is said in the admittedly later Book of Concord, the 11th chapter of the Epitome,
Yeah.
and compare it to Article 17, there's no real conflict there. There's a sort of um, pre Lutheran Orthodoxy, pre Calvinist scholasticism consensus on predestination. We have to have a doctrine of election because it's in Scripture, but we haven't yet worked out the details.
Yeah. 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 And then that's, I find, I mean, Article 17, speaks of it as a comfort, and find our very modest approach to be indeed very comforting.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking with a couple of prospective, potential diaconate candidates about a someone who got into trouble over Article 17, and one of the guys says, "How can you get in trouble? It's so mild."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you have to get pretty extreme to fall afoul of it.
Yeah, yeah, you do. Then really what I like to lay emphasis on is the consensus.
Mhm.
Because I think Anglicanism is a lot better off when its evangelical and Catholic impulses play along with each other.
Yeah.
If you look at the early 19th century Episcopal Church, you have people like Richard Channing Moore and Alexander Wirt Griswold, who were evangelicals who came from a high church background.
Hmm.
And they didn't really lose their high churchmanship, but they became much more Christocentric and crucicentric in their preaching.
Hmm.
You have high churchmen like Hobart and Hopkins who don't lose their Christocentric and crucicentric preaching stuff, preaching, when they become much more insistent upon bishops, the liturgy, the continuity of the Episcopal Church with the undivided church.
Hmm.
The two parties don't really pull apart until the third quarter of the 19th century, and that's really when the tensions that led to the formation of the REC appear.
Right, right.
Because you're beginning to get Anglican, Catholic-minded Anglicans who reject evangelicalism. And at the same time, you're getting evangelically minded Episcopalians who are beginning to reject Catholicism beyond the very minimum. The scriptures, the councils, the creeds.
And it's unfortunate, and this may be more of an online thing than a reality, but it seems like there's still a lot of keeping alive those late 19th century battles and seeing everything in the history through those lenses,
Hmm.
which is not only ahistorical, I just don't think it's very helpful. That said, when I do go to something like, yeah, I was at the ACNA assembly, a lot of the folks with less gray in their beards don't have
Hmm.
a lot of they don't seem to have a lot of patience for those late 19th century and 20th century partisanships.
No, they don't. I find with my clergy that there's kind of an abrupt break, and it's about the age of 55.
Mm-hmm.
The clergy who are my age and younger tend to be less interested in the 19th century disputes. Um, the older clergy, I think the reason it revived is to a certain extent the continuum with its tendency to stampede off to basically 1920s Anglo-Catholicism as the cure for all our ills on the one hand, and then of course there was that very uncomfortable reorientation of the REC
Mm-hmm.
that upset a lot of people at the time.
And that's kind of the early 90s when that happens. Is that right?
Actually, I think yeah, early to mid 90s.
Or the mid 90s? Yeah.
Yeah, I was involved with the Free Church of England at the time that was going on, and it was a little bit funny from our point of view because the Free Church of England had never been a black gown organisation.
Mm-hmm.
The black gown was used in the pulpit; it was not used in the reading desk or at the altar.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always a little bit of kind of oh dear, these Americans about the REC and the black gown.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, there was sort of a sense then that it was a healthy development in that it
Kind of
got,
getting away from the, Presbyterians with bishops
yeah,
picture that was often seen at the time. Yeah.
yeah, there's a sort of almost a sense that the REC had painted itself into a corner in the first quarter of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that in the last quarter of the 20th century, they were trying to paint themselves out of it, as it were.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
Now,
my own experience with them was so different that I mentioned before the show that I had used Perry's book, and he mentions in passing the Cummins schism. I'm like, what is he talking about? I was newly returned to the tradition and doing the last part of my master's as an Anglican, but it wasn't until years later that I even knew what the REC was, even though it's been around for well over 100 years.
I sort of tripped over the Free Church of England by accident because at the time the Church of England started to embrace liberalism in quite a determined way,
Hmm.
around my way, the folks who were opposed were either Anglo Catholic or conservative evangelical. And the conservative evangelicals, one or two of them drifted into the Free Church of England,
Mm-hmm.
which is how I found out about the REC.
Was through FCE. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so, with my background, this is probably why I'm probably less hung up on a lot of the 19th century disputes than a lot of people. My home church was basically the typical modern Anglican church. The priest faced the congregation to celebrate Holy Communion and wore a chasuble.
Mm-hmm.
The next church over was Eastward Position. The next church over to that was North End.
Yeah, and you don't hardly see that at all. That I don't. I think I know two North End churches in all of all of North America nowadays. I'm sure there's more. It's just, but yeah,
And I've got two in my diocese.
that brings my knowledge up to four then, because the two I know are REC churches, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, you
so,
get a little bit of it. It hung on
yeah,
quite late in Virginia.
yeah.
Um, there's a now retired ACC priest who used to dine out on the story that one of the professors at Virginia Seminary, when he was there in the 1960s, used to celebrate at the North End.
And all of them are kind of that more Laudian approach, where it's, there is an altar of, not so much a movable table, but an actual altar. And what is it, the lion and unicorn position, is that what it's
Yeah,
called?
Lion and Unicorn, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As
It
opposed
was
to like
quite
that
funny.
pre-Laudian. Yeah.
Yeah, the first two times I celebrated communion was a newly minted priest. Um, the first time I was covering a continuing Anglican parish down in the Midlands of England, and it was a case of teeter chasuble and do all the genuflections,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
which I didn't manage to say. I basically said, I'll do the chasuble, but I'm a middle of the road guy, so you're just going to have to go with it. I'll wear the uniform, but I can't, don't know the drill book.
Right.
And then the next week I was covering somewhere else, and they were Black Scarf and North End.
Oh my goodness. My
And
first time by myself was where I wasn't at the church I was ordained. It was
mm,
covering a continuum church, and I had never dealt with an Eastern facing. I figured out when to face the people and when to face the altar, but
mm,
doing that genuflection, I misjudged the way altars are set up, slammed my knee into it, and just couldn't get back up without falling over and crushing the host in my hand as I fell to the side. One of the people a bit more charismatic said, "We thought you got slain in the spirit."
yeah, I must admit, as I've gotten older, I think I've sort of ended up sort of fair in the middle on ceremonial.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I mean, I just don't see the point of quarreling about it or making a big fuss out of it. I tend to let the space dictate the ceremonial.
Yeah, that's how I've tended to approach it myself. Someone had told me once, the building always wins, and I realized, yeah, that's exactly right. The building does win, and we need to take it into account.
Yeah, I mean, my building, it's an old Lutheran church, and basically you end up doing the communion service pretty much the way the Lutherans would have done it. I mean, it's an eastward
Hmm.
facing stone altar.
Hmm.
You do the liturgy from the altar, and then you use the pulpit to preach. And there is no easy way of doing anything else in that building.
Yeah, that's how ours is too. It's requires the altar party to be pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
There was a previous rector here who really liked very high ceremonial, tried to one Christmas get like a 13-person altar party, and it was just impossible. I mean, it just doesn't fit. And so, yeah, it forces you to keep it a little bit simpler than the really, really Anglo Catholics would want things to be. But it's also kind of forces a much higher ceremonial, or at least more um, solemn ceremonial than a typical, versus populum Episcopal church would.
Yeah, so you can't do North End in my building
Oh, I couldn't fit on the north end for mine either. Yeah,
because there isn't enough step at the north end of the altar.
right, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
And you can't extend the step because somebody rather considerately put a heating register just at the end of the footpace. Um, yeah, I mean, the building always wins. I mean,
Well, yeah, great. Well, Bishop Robinson, I want to thank you so much for talking with me, and for your time. This was a lot of fun. as I said, I've been hanging around your old blog and followed you on the socials for a while, and I always appreciate the insights, and in particular that, just really jiving with that idea of the center of gravity, um, being those elements of Catholicity in our formularies, and we don't want to get too far off in the extremes. So I thank you for all those quick little writings you've done, and has helped me a lot. And I hope it helps some of our viewers and listeners too.
Thank you very much.
All right, Joel. Well, God bless. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you too.